So, till the last part we have discussed about the Italian landscape. So, now we are in the process of discussing about European landscape styles. Before that we had discussed about Oriental landscape. Of course, there was Spanish landscape which was also discussed. Now, in the Italian landscape, if you see the record that I have given chronologically, Italian landscape and French landscape and English landscape, they almost came side by side, but with a little bit of lag. What happened is the French landscape followed the Italian landscape and there was an overlap, and English landscape almost at the same time with the French landscape that it has carried on. Interestingly, all those landscapes are still persisting, still going on, and we are discussing this because they are essentially classic styles which we, the contemporary landscapists or landscape architects, landscape designers, we are trying to emulate. And they have earned such popularity and such kind of distinctive identity that this can be very useful for our landscape emulations. So, now let us look at the French landscape. The baseline information, the same structure which I had been following for all others, here also I will follow the same. The location France, period is 1400 to 1700 AD, latitude is 47 degree north and longitude is 2 degree east. The climate is continental climate in the central and the eastern France, and Mediterranean climate in the southern eastern France. So, that governed very similar to Italy, very similar to Italian climates. The terrain, it was mostly flat terrain or gently rolling hills. There are also mountainous areas in the southern part, and in the east we have the highest point, that is the Alps. Now, this gives a very typical of such landscape where we have the hills at a distance and we have the rolling grounds, rolling meadows, gentle terrains in the foreground. It is not hilly all through, and most of the French landscapes have been built over the fairly plains in this area, but the climate is of this kind as we have mentioned. Now, what is the architectural kind? It is very, very symmetric, very balanced, and most often there would be a structure like residence or castle or any other such kind of things which are being used by the rulers. They could be at the central part of the garden or it could be at the end. And there are lots of large paths. The whole area is subdivided into multiple squares or multiple such kind of rectilinear spaces which are called pathways. Geometric paths with a very strong symmetry, but water is one of the very strong element and it is an integral element of this particular landscape. This combination of building, pathways, pathways, water, that made a very distinct identity to this. Of course, water was also there in the Italian landscape. In fact, water is one of the strongest elements in most of the landscapes. Okay. There is a creation of reflecting pools. The pools are created in the foreground in such a manner that the buildings which are at the background, that will be reflected. The clouds of the sky, in general the European sky is very, very clear. They are very clear blue within which some sporadic white clouds looks excellent, and this is almost all through. Reflection of that sky with the blue sky and the clouds, white clouds, cluster of clouds or the buildings. That is what they have enhanced it, they have deliberately created it. The pathways have been created, different zones, rectilinear zones with intricate patterns, with hedges, shrubs and also flower beds. This pathway is one of the very, very strong element or distinctive element of this particular landscape. Folly building, they have been constructed for decorations. What is it, folly building? Basically, all these buildings are all for decorations, not much of any sense. They are just to create some kind of surprises, some kind of attraction, some kind of like wow effect, such things. Highly ornamental, very expensive maybe, but they became integral part of the French landscape. In Italian landscape, we did not see much of these folio buildings. Of course, there were signs of it. Some historians say that yes, there had been a flow of such idea to our French landscape, but in French landscape it has been done very, very deliberately and included. These were created essentially to create a kind of surprise or attraction to the visitors. Terraces, they were located in the landscape where entire garden can be viewed. So it is something like this. Like in Italian garden, we had the terraces made. Here, it's not necessary the terraces were on the gardens, but there were in the buildings as well as in the adjoining areas a slightly higher elevations from where if you stand, you see the whole garden at a stretch or at a glance. The rulers, they used to invite guests or else with their family members and their courtesans or their relatives, they used to view the entire garden at a glance. Essentially, the entire garden has been planned as if it's a visual painting. So what happened is the artistic senses of the garden that was very much introduced in the French landscape styles, and most often they became so very delicately geometrical and symmetrical that sometime it may be commented that the French landscape is too grand. There's so much of grandeur and less of naturality. Of course, everything is made with natural elements, but the idea is it could have been done in a different manner. But however, this is one system by which we have been endowed or we have been blessed with one another style of the garden. The features. From here, I'll go a little slow so that you get time to see different objects, different pictures and different points. Use of stucco wall, that was introduced during this time. Earlier in Italian and all of the landscape styles, the stuccos or the walls and the decorations on the walls, they were not very prominent. It was landscape within. Say for Spanish garden again, if I compare the landscape within, but buildings were on their own. But here they started introducing elements which became an integral parts of the garden itself. Very straight line, geometric shapes. Geometric shapes very much bounded by trimmed hedges. Trimmed hedges and shrubs. Basically, hedges are created with very low height and very nicely interwoven shrubs. So hedge became an element which was a contribution of the French garden, and now they have experimented with the hedges to a great extent. Of course, still there is a still trace of such hedges and formation of different kind of animal patterns with the hedges in the Italian garden. Gravel paths, stone terraces, they were different features. Sometimes the gravel paths were of monochromatic nature, means all the gravels of the same color. It's not mixed, it's whitish, maybe slightly brownish, but a monochromatic color hue that they have brought in. All these were experimented. They had window boxes. Window boxes are part of the buildings which are overlooking the gardens. Even window boxes were decorated with flower plants, with different season flower plants, so that even on the building facades we have different small stretches of nature, green, colorful flowers. It is said that yes, the root of the French formal style that was borrowed with the Italian from the Italian Renaissance. Yes, it is true, but there had been many more things which gave French landscape style an identity. So what happened is, in the whole process, it is just because the Italians started earlier and the French followed through and with overlap. So there had been at times objects, elements, styles, patterns, we almost matched. So sometime, if in a French landscape, looking at the French landscape without knowing where it is, it may be construed as Italian and vice versa. Elements. Pay attention to this elements. This is the first time in the landscape such building elements started coming in. French are the people who have brought these balusters. These balusters which they created, they become a part of the landscape. Balusters as it is a part of the architectural things, but here they started introducing it because it went through a long process of evolution. Cast iron seating, wooden seating, they became part of the landscape. Earlier, seating was mainly with the stones, a kind of bench or a kind of platform, but gradually these items like cast iron seating, wooden seating and such things started coming in. So what happened is, in elements in the landscape, what we see today, all these items are also considered to be elements in a modern landscape. Here I would like to point out one thing. If you recall, in my earlier lecture, I was discussing that there are different kind of elements, artificial, which we think as man-made, or natural. And if it is predominantly natural, then we term this as a landscape. If it is predominantly artificial and man-made, we consider this as a part of the architecture. But interestingly, here what happened is the artificial elements started coming in, but the scale of the overall nature was so large that small elements like this almost remained minuscule. So it never contradicted the same concept or the definition of the landscape that it is predominantly natural. Yes, there had been some, because these are all utility functions which started coming in. These utility in the landscape has been added during this period of time. Fountains. Fountains were there historically as well. If you see Spanish garden, yes, they had the fountains, but they had the fountains like small spouts, and they were low height, and they were watered by flowing water by gravity. So naturally the force of the fountains were not very great. Here what happens, and they were only for cooling purposes and in a small scale. What happened here is the fountain earned a grand scale. There had been multiple such fountains in the same landscape, example maybe. Now this became a very interesting, attractive feature, because the idea during this French and Italian styles, or rather I would say mostly in European styles, was the ruler wanted to show their power, show their authority, show their wealth, show their sense of art, show their sense of architecture. So they wanted everything to be in grand scale. So this grand scale brought even fountains to be experimented. It was really a very good time for all the artists, sculptors. They started contributing into the landscape design. So it was not anymore a scope of a typical landscape designer. It was sculptors who contributed to this particular landscape. Pea gravels of different sizes. So these are all elements in the French landscape. Other elements, cast iron or wood planters. If you remember in the Italian landscape style, when I was discussing, I talked about the orangery, and the orangery that was placed in the wooden pots or earthen pots. Now this becomes slightly more formalized in the French landscape style, in which what happened is cast iron and wooden pot holders or plant holders, they became almost a strong element in the landscape. So it is, looking at this, one can make out, oh, if there are such kind of plant boxes or plant holders, it is French landscape styles. Elegant furnitures, cast iron or wooden furnitures which were made for outdoor sitting, many other indoor kind of furnitures, lightweight, simple, elegant furniture, they also started becoming part of the landscape, and they are placed almost at the junction of the building and the landscapes. The natural stones. If you keep on looking at all these examples, you will find, and if you follow through the current landscape styles, you will find that there are tendencies, or rather I would say there is an attempt that people have tried to emulate those. Nothing wrong, as long as it serves a good purpose and it almost excites and encourages the people who are looking at it, it's fine, there's nothing wrong. Stone steps, if you look at this particular picture, focus at this particular picture, you will find that the stone steps almost embedded in the midst of the grass. It is not a grand stone staircases, it is a mix of stone, then creepers, grasses, so that natural stone, though it is very much formalized in shape, but it has not been given a very sharp edges or sharp forms. It has been kept to be as if a minimal work of craftiness on this particular stones, which has been placed in the grass or the green. The idea is something like this, that okay, had there been some stones there automatically, naturally, then you would have stepped onto from grass to the stone, to the grass to the stones and such. Here it has been created similar. So what happens is, even if these items which are, it is natural material of course, but step is not a natural item. Step is a step in natural form, of course it's a natural item, but steps, this kind of organized or very regulated steps, are very much artificial forms. But this never has overshadowed the effects of the naturality. This is what is excellent part of these elements. Glazed pots. Most often these glazed pots used to be the common indoor material, indoor element, but they started flowing out. So what happened is, if suppose there is a building within which you have the glazed pots maybe, but the thing is there is a terrace which is just next to it. That is, the building now, building external wall flows to the terrace, and terrace which is a part of the architectural element. From there you look around and see the garden. On the terrace, on the steps, on the sides of the steps, and maybe slightly overflowing, these glazed pots were used. So essentially, even if it is an artificial element, it became an integral part of the landscape in French landscape styles. Then different antiques, they were placed at different places wherever required. Now if you see this, all these elements are almost, these elements like antiques, statues and all this, they are almost similar to the Italian. But the thing is, furniture that came into blended with the landscape, this, as we do see that it is a contribution of the French landscapists or French landscape styles. The columns, the gazebos like this, they started coming in. That means the structure, which was predominantly an architectural element, started coming into the landscape, blended into the landscape with small sizes, and that, when we will discuss English landscape, we will see there also it followed through, and it is being followed even today. So it is basically large architectural building with a foreground or background of flat, very ornamental, geometrically shaped landscapes, gradually got turned into small other architectural elements coming into the garden and becoming a part of the garden elements. So these should be considered as a garden elements, not purely an architectural elements. Trellis, there are different ways of mentioning this, trellis or arbors. Basically what is trellis or arbors is, you have a frame, you have a flower bed or creeper bed, and you put the frame in such manner that the creepers are now allowed to flow over the frames. If I just try to give you a sketchy figure, it is something like this. Just look at this paper, you will see it is, I am just drawing what trellis is theoretically, a frame. Let me draw it very simply first and then explain. Very simply, a frame like this, which will be standing on the base of the soil, and then there will be a bed. On this bed it will be a soil bed, and that will be created, planted with the creepers on this. This creepers now will grow and they will be supported on this particular vertical frame. When they are supporting it, I will give the idea of all these elements later on in some other lectures, but here, since the trellis has come in, let me explain. These creepers will be then followed and tied up with these vertical frames or horizontal frames, the way the designer is planning. Eventually what will happen is, after all these are covered with these creepers, the entire of this particular surface will become covered with standard creepers. This is the kind of thing which is trellis. Now, trellis does not necessarily mean that it has to be vertical alone. Trellis can be even going horizontally like this, over which we have the frames, and this creeper will flow through and ultimately come to this particular directions, and it will cover up the whole thing. And now if you see that once you block the other side as well with the trellis, where you have another set of creepers which are now allowed to grow over these surfaces, and now the entire thing gets covered with creepers. Let me use the green color just to give an idea with respect to this trellis. These are the areas which is basically the green areas, and this creepers will flow over the entire surfaces. From here again it has the green bases, and from here again the whole creepers will go up. So ultimately what happens is the entire area is creeper covered. This is what is trellis. Now more you extend it, like if you extend it in this manner, if you extend the trellis along a longer directions, this will be considered as arbors. Even if suppose you have a shorter stretch of this, this will be considered as arbors. If you keep generally definition wise, if you keep it only vertical, generally it is trellis. There are interesting designs that people do create with the trellis. So here in this particular picture, if you see, it is this, it is here an arbor. From this particular base there is a frame here, the frame runs and ultimately comes onto this side. So basically two frames coming from the other side, it's a kind of arch, and at the base they have creeper plants planted, and these creepers are allowed to carry over this. This is a very, very common element when we want to create a sort of archway or an entry of a residence, and you want to put some kind of very highly fragrant or nicely intricately flowering creepers. This becomes a very interesting element, and we have got it from French landscape styles. Okay. Then another element which has come in, which has almost become a very important element of contemporary landscapes, that is for ecological balances, that's called bird bath. Here they have introduced the bird bath. This is one container in which there will be water, because birds, if you want to attract birds, you have to, in the landscapes, first of all you have to give good quality of vegetation, and the vegetation also should have some kind of fruits which the birds can eat. Even other than that, that is the kind of climate that you are creating for this. Even other than that, without the vegetation, if you keep a container and you give fodder, the bird feeds, and then you give water, the birds will automatically get attracted to this. So the bird bath concept that they have introduced, which is, I consider in today's landscapes, is very, very essential, because in the urbanity that we are going, process of urbanization that we are going through, in this what is happening is we are losing almost all the bird species, because we are not giving them proper environment, proper climate, even food. So this is what they have introduced. Now let me give an example of this, a very strong example of French garden style. I will elaborate this a little more. I'll go a little further slow so that you have a chance to see each picture, but listen to me when I am also narrating along with this. The gardens of Versailles is the best example that we think should be cited for explaining exactly what the French landscape is. If you look at it, I will first go through all the points together so that you have a very clear idea. See, this particular example we have picked up for a reason. First of all, if you look at this particular picture, you will find that this is the entire garden. You would see that there is a strong central and transverse axis. So they have used the axis in the cruciform. Where did you find it in my earlier lectures, earlier examples of historical landscapes? Did you find this really in Spanish? Not really, not really. It was not like that. Did you find it in Chinese, Japanese? No. Did you find it in Mughal? Yes. Now if you go by this time chronology, then you will find that Mughal garden styles and the European garden styles almost grew together at the same period. Now since they have grown in the same period, we are not very sure who borrowed from whom, because they have grown in different regions, but there must have been some influence where this axiality, symmetry, strong geometry, all these were playing a role. Okay, the Versailles example, let's see a little more detail. So, it is about 800 acres, a large area, very large area within which the whole landscape is. Now, this gives an idea to us about the scale. The scale means here 800 hectares of area, a garden. Can you imagine? Is too large to be comprehensible at one site. Here, contrary to the other landscapes, in Spanish landscape you go from one court to another court to another court, and you see each court individually. You do not get a chance to see all the landscapes together. You go to Chinese landscape styles, you will find that you are going from one zone to another zone to another zone. You do not have really a chance to see the entire garden at a glance. Same is true with Japanese. You are taken through pathways from one place to another place to another place, so that gradually individual spaces with its intricately detailed landscape is being exposed to you. But in Mughal we have found, yes, from one point you can see the whole landscape styles. In Italian, from one point you can see almost the entire landscape styles. In French, yes, from one point you can see the entire landscape styles. That is the basic difference, but only thing is the difference also in scale. In this kind of landscapes, when you have a grand area and seeing the whole thing at one glance gives you a full idea of almost like a carpet. But to really enjoy the intricately detailed designs of pathways, of the hedges, of the topiaries, or even the paths, you have to really walk into different zones of it. So, here it is too grand a scale. Every part is well crafted, well designed and well maintained, and that is the excellent part of it. Okay. There is a broad central walkway. If you look at this particular picture, there is a structure here. This particular structure from where you can look over the entire garden, and this is what the rulers wanted. They also have gardens which is also at the back. So, they have different parts. So, building is a building by itself, and then foreground and the background are individual parts, and not necessarily there is any harmony between these two designs. But one thing is sure, they are very geometric, they are very symmetrical, they have a strong axis. They even have a cruciform kind of axis in here, north, south, east, west kind, and individual areas are highly compartmentalized, very distinct compartments. Now, do not get confused by the charbagh concept that I discussed in the Mughal garden. Mughal garden has whatever area divide by 4. Here it is not necessarily divide by 4. Here as many such kind of compartments. If you look at this picture where my cursor is running, you will see that this is the central line. Then we have the transverse axis which is with water, and then we have one such zone, another zone here, another zone here, another zone here, and in such manner. So, the point is these are pathways, means different parts of different zones that they have created, and there are trellis and such other items. And central water feature such as fountains and the water feature, they were very essential for French landscape styles. Now, if you look at the entire plan, what I will discuss next is different elements. So, let me conclude at this particular point in terms of planning that there had been various new introduction of the elements in landscape during French landscape period. Some are borrowed from the Italian landscapes and some are original. Next, we will discuss about the elements in detail.